Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I like to begin all workshops with that. I think it's important that we acknowledge, what traditional lands that we're operating from. And if anybody is unsure of what traditional lands that they're currently on, I encourage you to check that out. I'm going to pop a link in the chat for you to look at that. Those who are watching this recording later on, you can go to whos.land to figure that out. Just wanted to put that out there. So before we begin, I'm just going to explain my own kind of personal relationship and background with mindfulness-based practices. So I wasn't really aware of mindfulness or the concept until quite a few years ago. When I was doing my first undergraduate degree, I was taking a world religions class. We're studying Buddhism. Then I realized that the school that I was going to had a program called Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health, which sounds really interesting, and I thought it was really interesting. So I enrolled in that program. And through that program, I understood the relationship between these traditional Eastern practices, such as mindfulness and meditation, and how they can be used in our Western practices of mental health treatment, day-to-day stress-based reduction, and just how to kind of improve overall focus and just general, cognitive clarity and emotional bandwidth. So there was a lot of really interesting benefits that I was learning about through those courses. In a very kind of clinical and academic context, it was also really valuable to understand the cultural context of that as well. A lot of the studies that we see on mindfulness have been done with traditional Buddhist monks, and there is a difference in those outcomes versus practicing within a secular society. So that's important to note throughout this workshop as well, is that there is a lot of research coming out about mindfulness and the clinical day-to-day benefits to that. Some of that research we have to take with a grain of salt, considering who was involved in the study, if they are traditional Buddhist monks or practicing Buddhists, or if they are everyday lay people. So we want to take that into consideration. But even more than that, there's always a benefit to mindfulness in some capacity. And we'll be looking at all those kinds of benefits and why and how these practices can be most useful. Beyond my education, I've found in my clinical and professional practice, mindfulness to be a very, very practical tool. I think I talk about it at least 3 or 4 times a day with clients in various capacities, whether it's talking about managing anxieties, being mindful of cognitive distortions, unhelpful thinking styles, bringing awareness to our current experience, leaning more into our experiential selves and that we're being more present with what we're experiencing. So there's a lot of really great uses for mindfulness, and so we'll be talking about that a little bit more. So my intention today is to make mindfulness more relatable and practical for you as individuals. So I understand that for a lot of folks, again, this term mindfulness is a buzzword right now. It's been a buzzword for the last 5 or 7 years. What does it actually mean? How do we actually use this? Why is it important? Why should we even be talking about that? So to kind of set the stage, I want to use this analogy of that our mind is a spotlight. And so we think of our minds as the spotlight being our attention. So, when we have it paying attention to something, our spotlight is on whatever that thought or thing is. Unfortunately, a lot of the times that spotlight is hijacked by like a monkey or an animal, and it's kind of going everywhere. So it's like you are the operator of the spotlight, then you take a step away, and then a monkey takes your place, and now the spotlight's going in all different directions, and then you're not focusing on one thing at once but multiple things, and it's really hard and it's exhausting, and it creates this cognitive noise and distraction. And so that's what we really want to be mindful of. And so we want to move away from that and have greater control over that spotlight, aka the kind of attention and the focusing on our thoughts and experiences. So I'm going to pose a question to everybody. How many times have you downloaded Headspace or Calm or whatever, any of these kinds of mindfulness-based apps, and then deleted it or abandoned it, or tried a meditation practice and then got frustrated because it wasn't working the way that you had hoped it would, and then abandoned that? Again, I want this presentation to be as engaging as possible, so let me know. Raise your hand, go into the chat. I see some engagement already. So yeah, somebody said once or twice. Somebody raised their hand. That's great. Really relatable. I know when I was trying to start meditating and doing mindfulness practices, it took me so many times to get into a routine of it. I would try it, for a few days and be like, oh, this is making me feel more anxious, or I'm irritable, I'm impatient, I don't get it. I thought this was supposed to have all these benefits. Why isn't it working for me? So we have these expectations of what mindfulness is going to produce for us. And when those expectations are let down, we tend to abandon it because it is easier said than done. And it's often, presented to us in a way that's maybe less accessible than what it can be. And so that's, again, one of the goals of this workshop is to make it more practical, make it more relatable, more accessible, so that you can find a practice that works for you as an individual. You don't just have to meditate. So there's more to mindfulness than just meditation. There is mindfulness-based meditation, but again, that's only one kind of subset of mindfulness. So we're going to be looking at kind of zooming up from that a little bit and looking at ways that it can be a little bit more relatable and accessible for you. So again, the goals for today's session, trying to discover, understand, explore what exactly mindfulness is. We'll be looking at the difference between mindfulness and meditation, because like I said, those two ideas and concepts are often conflated. We'll be looking at the role of thoughts and emotions in the context of mindfulness. And so we're looking at, why mindfulness is used in therapy in specific modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. It's used for a reason, and it helps us have more control over thoughts and emotions. So we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. And then mindfulness in action is referring to some of the tools and practices that I'll introduce near the end of this session, so that you have some tools to walk away from and that you have some practical skills that you can use to start integrating mindfulness on a more regular basis. And at the end of this workshop, I'll also open up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, keep those to the end. If the questions are relevant to what we're talking about, you can pop in the chat. But just generally, if you have any questions, I'll make sure that there's time at the end to address that. So like I said, what is mindfulness? Everybody has a different idea of what that is. So if anybody has any ideas they want to share, pop them in the chat. What comes to mind when you think about mindfulness? What is mindfulness to you? It can seem kind of vague, ambiguous. So what is it when you think about mindfulness? What is that concept to you? So feel free to pop in the chat if you'd like. But again, mindfulness is different for everybody. So some people might think of this as being what mindfulness is. Um, Others might think it's, being organized in that kind of way, allowing focus. Some folks might think it's being present, in the present moment, engaging with that experiential experience, or just, being calm to yourself and focused on one thing at a time. All these things are true. All these things are mindfulness. So someone said in the chat, counting your blessings, all the small things in life. So being aware, having a practice of gratitude, absolutely, that can fall under this umbrella of mindfulness. Being perceptive of the things that are going on in your life, yeah, definitely. So as I demonstrated, as someone just mentioned in the chat, mindfulness is a broad kind of idea and concept. So it's not one specific idea. It's kind of an umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of different practices, approaches, and understandings of our day-to-day life. So in particular, mindfulness has roots in ancient Buddhist tradition. Jon Kabat-Zinn, one of the founders of, mindfulness-based practices in the Western society, reminds us that while Buddhism has refined and articulated this practice, the ability to be mindful is not actually inherently Buddhist. As humans, we all carry the ability to be mindful. Those Eastern traditions just gave us more rigid practices and useful tools to be able to really cultivate mindfulness, and really gave us an understanding and conceptualization of the importance and value of it. So we don't want to discredit those Eastern traditions such as Buddhism. They've played a huge role in terms of accelerating the practice of mindfulness. But as Kabat-Zinn explains, it's not exclusive to those Eastern traditions in that we all have a natural ability to cultivate mindfulness. It's just something that we have to be more aware and intentional about. So like I said, the idea between mindfulness and meditation can be often conflated. So let's really make this clear. So oftentimes these words are used interchangeably, but mindfulness can be considered a state of mind to increase awareness on the present moment. It can be practiced at any point in the day, whereas meditation is an act that is practiced for a set amount of time and can be done in many different forms, such as chanting, projecting love and compassion, focusing on the mind, doing body scans. So there's different kinds of meditation practices. They're more rigid, where mindfulness, again, is that more broad, loose term, and meditation fits under that umbrella. So mindfulness is the more broad term. Meditation is one of the more specific practices. So mindfulness, it can enrich meditation, is a particular style of meditation. And mindfulness can be characterized by a clarity and vividness of the current experience. And you'll notice the use of a lot of detail in the description of the experience as well. So like someone said, noticing all the small things in your life, you're paying attention to those kinds of details. And that's really what mindfulness is bringing that attention, again, taking control back of the spotlight in your life, and pointing it to things that maybe otherwise you wouldn't be pointing it to. And at times that means pointing inward. And we'll be looking at a little bit more when we talk about the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors as well. So why do we talk about mindfulness? Why is this a relevant topic of discussion? Why do we talk about it in therapy? How can it be helpful? So again, it can be helpful in a lot of different ways. So it helps us be aware of how we were doing throughout the day in real time before we blow up or react in a negative or challenging way. It kind of prevents us from going on that autopilot or just operating from our default mode network. It helps us take the story out of difficult experiences so we can stick to the facts. Again, it helps us, be mindful of the perception that we're creating, especially when that perception isn't that helpful for us. So again, there's that relationship between thoughts and emotions. We want to be perceptive and mindful of that. It helps us to experience our thoughts and feelings without judging them. And that's something that we typically are all very guilty of, is that we have this inherent bias against ourselves that creates this judgment. The more that we can be aware and mindful of that judgment, the more we can suspend that and move away from that in a way that's more objective and kind and compassionate towards ourselves. It helps us ground us in the here and now, especially when we're feeling anxious or scared or worried. We will really want to be able to kind of ground ourselves in that. So using mindfulness-based tools is something that I often offer to clients who experience heightened anxiety or some kind of panic attack. It can be very useful in those moments. And it really allows us to own our joy, and that, when we are experiencing feelings of elation or life satisfaction, we can sit with that in a more meaningful way rather than just kind of moving through that on autopilot, as I had kind of mentioned. On the slide, there's a various other benefits of mindfulness that we can identify as well. So it can lessen depression, it can increase that capacity for joy, offer more self-kindness or compassion, lower your blood pressure, decrease risk of mental illness, as it's just a great best practice for taking care of your mind and your emotional experience. So take a second, look over all those things. And this is the reason why you're here today. There's a lot of benefits to this, and so we want to be familiar with how it can be helpful for us. With that said, we want to be considerate and mindful of also the expectations we have. And so although it can do all these wonderful things, all these things are not going to happen the first time you practice mindfulness. It's about being intentional about that. What are you looking to achieve? If you're looking at developing more self-compassion, then you want to develop mindfulness practices that are directed towards that. If you want to, lessen your depression, then you really want to focus on that kind of mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy approach, where you're really taking control of your thoughts and behaviors and your emotions. So again, depending on what outcomes you're looking to address, that's going to impact and determine the kind of mindfulness-based practices that you're looking to kind of engage with. So if it's so good for us, like I said, if there's all these benefits, why do we struggle with it? In my opinion, we get lost in all the benefits because we don't know what our ending destination set is for ourselves. Like I said, you want to be mindful of those expectations. You really want to be cognizant and intentional about what destination you're trying to get to through mindfulness-based practices. So in that, I like to think of meditation as providing four core benefits. So these benefits are, the practicing, the immediate relaxation that you receive from this practice, distress tolerance, and decided action, which again is just more of an intentional approach to whatever you want to accomplish. So again, we don't understand mindfulness often because we focus on the immediate benefits. We get really stuck on the immediate relaxation or anxiety alleviation, rather than the long-term growth, as in that kind of decided action, the top of that pyramid. So people are like, I'm relaxed now. What? I'm not experiencing any of those other benefits you had promised. It's because we're getting stuck in that, and we need to look beyond that. And this is a real matter of, short-term versus long-term gratification as well. So that's something that we want to be considerate, mindful, and cognizant of, so that that relaxation is an awesome side effect. That there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're going to keep going, you need to build distress tolerance. You want to work towards decided action. You want to be really intentional with the practices that you're using so that you can transcend beyond just the relaxation. So you're practicing, you're relaxing, and then maybe you want to work towards distress tolerance, emotional regulation, avoiding reactivity based on your emotional experience, being more considerate of how you're perceiving things, the kind of stories you're telling yourself, and then beyond that now towards that kind of decided action, self-actualization of living the life that exactly you want to live, and using the tools of mindfulness to help get you there. So if anybody has any questions about mindfulness, the benefits, how to get there, we can continue talking about that, but hopefully that provides you some kind of idea of what mindfulness is, what we can hope to achieve through that, the difference between mindfulness and meditation, and what you can hope to achieve throughout the process. So like I said, the role of thoughts and emotions is really, really helpful when thinking about the purpose and value within mindfulness. We'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. Before we dive into that, I want to just do a quick check-in. How are people feeling this moment? So let's do a little kind of mindfulness-based activity. So sit still for a minute, get comfortable, and I want you to do a bit of a body scan. And what a body scan is this is a very great grounding tool that you can use if you're feeling anxious, if you're in a panic state, if you're disassociating in any capacity. So body scan is just focusing on the feeling, the physical feeling throughout your body. So what I like to do with body scans is start with your toes and then work your way up all the way through your body. So take a few moments, starting with your toes, see how your toes feel. Are they cold? Are they numb? Are they wiggling? How are your toes feeling? Then go to your feet, then how your ankles feeling, your calves, your knees, your thighs, your midsection, your stomach, and then you want to go to your fingers. How are your fingers feeling? How are your hands, your forearms, your biceps, your shoulders, your chest, your neck, and then your head. And this is just a very simple exercise. And I'm going through it kind of quickly, but if you take a little bit more time, it can be very, very relaxing. If you're having trouble sleeping, you can do this before bed. It's a great way to kind of just check in with your body as well. One of the great things about doing a body scan is that we often carry a lot of our stress and our emotions physically. It can help us identify that tension that we might be carrying in places like our shoulders or our neck, our chest. If we're feeling that knot in our stomach, that might signify some anxiety or frustration. So think about how you're feeling, both physically, emotionally, and mentally. And something that I like to offer in most of my workshops is this resource of a feeling wheel. So I think we all can really benefit from improving our emotional literacy. So oftentimes when we think about how we're feeling, we think about these kind of inner circle, these primary emotions. But we feel much more than that. And I think it's really helpful for us to be as specific as possible when identifying our emotions. The reason for that is there are a lot of neuroscience suggests that the more accurately we can label and identify our emotions, the more manageable it is to kind of deal with those emotions. Furthermore, our emotions often can signify what our needs are, what needs aren't being met. And so we really want to try to identify, really precisely what we're feeling. We're also recognizing that we're likely feeling more than one emotion at once. So when we did the body scan, that feeling in your body, that sensation, what is that reflecting? Is it reflecting any of these feelings, any of these emotions? How are you feeling in this moment? Be present with that. Don't think about how you were 10 minutes ago, how you think you might be tonight. How are you feeling exactly in this moment, both physically, emotionally, and mentally? And if anybody would like to share, then feel free to do so. Someone said, I'm feeling anxious about my future. Yeah, that's a really common feeling, and it's really valuable to be, cognizant of that. And, I would encourage you to even go deeper than that, what are you feeling beyond that anxiety? Are you feeling any insecurity, any hopelessness, any fear, any insignificance? Look towards that kind of scared part of the feeling wheel and try to identify as precisely as possible what you're feeling anxious about. What are the micro feelings within that? And try to understand the context of why you're feeling that, what's triggering that anxiety for you. So really helpful to be present with those emotions. So thank you for sharing that. And these mindfulness-based tools are going to help you not only identify that anxiety, but also give you the tools to kind of give yourself a break from that anxiety from time to time as well. I know when I was a student, that kind of free-floating anxiety with the future was something that was present most of the time, most of the day. So even if you can have a break from that through meditation or mindfulness-based practices, that can be helpful to just energize yourself and avoid any further burnout or exhaustion. So again, thank you for sharing that. So like I said, you can feel more than one thing at once. So you can feel two things at once. You can feel four or five, six things at once. And we want to be mindful of that. And sometimes these feelings contradict one another and it can be kind of confusing. And we want to be mindful and considerate of that as well. So even though these feelings are contradicting, they're not mutually exclusive. So you might feel hope and fear at the same time. You might feel joy and loneliness at the same time. One might be more prominent than the other, and that's also okay. That's not a reason to discount or dismiss that emotion. You might feel proud and anxious. You might feel angry. You might feel curious, happy, sad, grateful, disappointed. So lots of conflicting feelings, and you want to be mindful of what are the source of those feelings for you. Why do you feeling these contradicting emotions? What's the origin of that, and what does that tell you? And how are you navigating that? Because I think when we're experiencing these contradicting feelings, it can be overwhelming for us. We don't really know how to perceive that, and we typically lean into the more challenging emotion and dismiss the one that's maybe more helpful for us. So, like I had said, emotions are simply messengers for us. They signify what our needs are. Um, this is always accurate. So mindfulness gives us the ability to understand our emotions more accurately. So we might be feeling an anxiety. Does that actually mean that we're in a fight or flight position where we need to engage in a stress response? Probably not. And so we really want to be mindful of that. We want to like talk to our brain in that kind of way. That's helpful to kind of pivot in our approach to dealing with whatever stressors are coming our way. From an adaptation perspective, we can divide our emotions into three categories, being drive, threat, and soothe. Drive is a kind of motivating feeling. It's often driven by things like endorphins. And then soothing can be, the source of contentment, happiness, feeling restful. So all these systems are important, and ideally these emotion systems are balanced to be optimal. Though oftentimes threat is the most sensitive and the most motivating. And so that's something that we really want to start being more aware of in terms of our emotional experiences. How much is threat taking the driver's seat? So like someone said, they're feeling anxious. Anxiety seems to be a very pervasive feeling that many of us experience, and it seems to be taking the driver's seat a lot of the time. There's nothing wrong with anxiety. Anxiety and stress are very valuable and important, but we want to make sure that it's not always taking the driver's seat, because it can create an accurate representation of reality as well. So when we talk more about this relationship between thoughts and emotions, you might be feeling anxious, and that's going to then therefore impact what you're thinking about things. The way that you think about things is therefore going to play back into the emotions. So you really want to be mindful of that bi-directional relationship, so that you can have more control over that, to say, okay, I feel anxious. I understand why I'm anxious, but I don't need my anxiety to kind of create cognitive distortions. I don't need to jump to conclusions. I don't need to catastrophize or dismiss certain evidence or experience. Let me be more objective about this. So that's the mindfulness tools allow us to not only identify what we're feeling, but if we can understand why we're feeling like that, then it puts us in a better position to also respond. So we're still in the pandemic, so I think it's relevant to talk about how COVID is also stirring up our emotions, and how we can be more mindful of that as well. So these are all things that most people are experiencing that maybe you haven't been as cognizant of, or you haven't been able to put it into words. And so we want to look at doing that. We want to be more mindful and aware of that. So things that are maybe going on in terms of emotions based on the pandemic, the uncertainty in the future of the pandemic, how things are going to continue to change. That's going to create some anxiety. Coping with social distancing, whether it's adjusting to the new normal. If you're vaccinated, reducing some of that social distancing. If you're unvaccinated, having to continue social distancing in a meaningful way. The layoff and job loss created through the pandemic. Worrying about your friends and family. Grief for loss of major events and milestones. Frustrations, the difficulty in focusing, guilty, juggling money roles, and difficulty separating, school and life. And so we really want to try to identify these challenges that have been created over the last, I don't know, what is 18 months now or something like that, almost 2 years, which is kind of wild. Um, and so we want to be mindful of those impacts. And I think it's something that a lot of folks have had troubles with, because when they have been aware of it, it's been heavy on them and they don't know what they do with that. So part of mindfulness is not just to acknowledge, but it's also to figure out an actual plan to respond to that, so that you're not reacting in a way that's not as helpful or healthy. So like I said, there is this intrinsic relationship between emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. It's a multi-directional relationship. And the more that we can be mindful of this, the greater control we can have of this. Um, so this kind of concept is the foundation of therapeutic modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy. It's about having an awareness of this multi-directional relationship. If we can identify how our emotions might be impacting our thoughts, we can have greater control over our thoughts and how they then impact our emotions and our behavior. So we want to just be extremely aware and cognizant of this relationship, so that we're not reacting in an unhealthy way. For example, if someone says something upsetting to you, you might feel angry. That's the emotion. Then that emotion might create thoughts of how dare they, how could they, I hate that person, they're so disrespectful. And that might lead to a behavior like punching a hole in the wall. And that's not all that helpful. Although it may feel good in that moment, it's going to create more problems for you. So if you can start with that emotion and say, okay, I'm feeling angry because this person did that. If you can be aware and have that mindfulness of that and understand that, then you can have the control and ability to prevent any unhelpful thoughts or behaviors by saying, okay, that person was pretty rude to me, but I think they're going through a hard day today. I shouldn't be taking this personally. I have the control and ability to respond in a meaningful way. So I know there's a bigger picture to this. Maybe they weren't trying to slight me, and therefore, I'm going to give them some space. I'm going to set up a boundary for myself. That's a much healthier way to respond to that situation, rather than just reacting to it. So again, the ability to take a step back mentally is so important. And the work that I did in my first undergraduate degree in that Buddhist psychology mental health program, that was one of my biggest takeaways. Is if we can be more cognizant of these mental processes, how we're interpreting our experiences, our events, and if we can have more emotional regulation as a result of that, that's going to be extremely helpful, not just for us, but those around us as well. So we really want to be mindful of that. And so, through mindfulness practice, it becomes easier to have that kind of awareness. So mindfulness practice trains the attentional system of the brain. So puts those kinds of thoughts at the top of your mind. Because oftentimes I tell clients, it would be really helpful if you could take a step back and understand what you're feeling and why you're feeling. The hardest part isn't asking those questions, it's remembering to ask those questions, especially when you're in a heightened state of emotion, you're less likely to. So through ongoing mindfulness practices, it helps you keep those questions on the top of your mind. It makes it more accessible to have that meaningful engagement. So the engagement itself doesn't seem that hard, but what's most difficult is remembering to do that, is to be mindful that you need to do that. So through practice mindfulness-based exercises and practices and activities, you'll be able to have that on the top of your mind more often. So that's really the goal. That's really what I wanted to try to demonstrate through this relationship between emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So being mindful of our emotions. In conclusion for this section, being a witness to our thoughts and feelings without judgment allows us the space to decide with intention how to respond to a given situation or stimulus. So when you develop that kind of awareness and mindfulness, you're able to also suspend that judgment that otherwise we would be, imposing upon our experiences. So we really want to be mindful of that. As the viewer behind that spotlight that we've been talking about, we might start to notice our emotions, behaviors, and thoughts starting to interact and run around stage. And before you know it, the characters are creating their own story and we're just left there to watch. But then we are able to remind ourselves that we are actually the watcher behind the lens and we can choose to shift our focus and make a change. So it gives us the ability to be the director of the play. In essence, having more control over our experience. Hopefully that analogy wasn't too confusing and weird, but I like to try and explain that to make it a little less abstract. So that, if we don't have this awareness, if we don't have this mindfulness of our experiences, then our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions will start running the show without us using that executive function to be able to direct things. So we really want to take that control back. The best way to take that control is to sharpen these tools of mindfulness and awareness in general. Anybody have any questions so far, or any concerns, thoughts, feelings, anything? Okay, not a problem. Again, any questions? We'll leave some space at the end to address any thoughts or concerns or questions. So what is mindfulness in action? How do we actually make mindfulness practical? The whole point of this workshop is to try and figure out how to make mindfulness more relatable, understandable, and practical. So what is mindfulness in action? This could be considered mindfulness in action. Being present with friends at an event, something that you probably haven't done in a little while, but probably hoping that you want to do soon. So what are the basics of cultivating mindfulness? It's important to think of it as a skill that needs to be developed. So just like any other skill, whether it's, learning a new hobby or learning a new instrument, you're not going to be good the first time you pick up the guitar. It takes a lot of practice. You want to approach mindfulness-based practices in the same way. So it's a verb, but there's no end. So you don't do mindfulness for 10 months to achieve something. It's an ongoing process and practice. It's a verb. Um, it's simple, but it's not easy. I know that sounds contradictory, but again, the practice of mindfulness doesn't have to be complicated. That doesn't mean that it's easy though. So again, there's not much to it, but it means that it still takes a lot of work. It's the same with, learning an instrument. So I play guitar. It's not that hard to play guitar. You get used to playing scales, you learn chords, but it takes a lot of effort to put the time into doing it. And that's the same with meditation and mindfulness. And it comes from consistent, imperfect practice. And this is something that I really want to drive home because I think a lot of folks get discouraged the first dozen times they try it and they don't achieve the results that we've outlined in this session. And they become very discouraged as a result of that. So expect imperfection. Imperfection is necessary within this process. It's not going to feel right the first few times you do it. I would say the first 10 to 14 times that you practice mindfulness activities, it's not going to land that well for you. You may not even feel that relaxed. You might actually even feel more agitated. Again, I know when I first tried to meditate, I did like a 20-minute meditation and it was horrible. I felt even more anxious. My mind was just spinning. Realized that that was probably not a great introduction to mindfulness-based practice. And then I pivoted and started to do other things. So there's different types of mindfulness. Like I said, it's not just meditation. There's different things that we can do. So you can do mindful eating, and this is one of the most accessible practices that you can do. So instead of going on your phone or watching TV while you eat, what you can do to practice mindfulness is focus on that sensory experience. And what I mean by that is focus on the taste, the texture, the smell, how the food feels, what's the temperature of the food. Really engage with your food, pay attention to that, maybe even close your eyes to enhance the rest of that sensory experience. So again, mindfulness doesn't have to be complicated. It can be easy as eating or walking. So walking is another great one because you can engage with that sensory experience as well. So maybe the next time you go for a walk, don't bring your headphones, don't listen to a podcast, just go for a walk, listen to the sounds, pay attention to your environment. What are you seeing? What are you smelling? What are you hearing? What are you feeling underneath your feet? Paying attention to that sensory experience is, again, another mindfulness practice. Doesn't have to be complicated. It can be found within these everyday activities. It's about the intention on focusing on the present experience. And you can do that through many different avenues as we're looking at. Meditation is one of those more obvious ones. It requires more work, but it's also really, really helpful, and it has a lot of valuable outcomes for that. So it's a more of a structured, rigid practice, but because of that, you can achieve different results from doing eating or walking. So if you're more serious about cultivating, focus or relaxation or managing anxieties, then I recommend doing meditation. And there's more resources for that than ever. Such as Calm or Headspace. If you have a Netflix account, there's a great series by Headspace right now on there that really walks through mindfulness practices, particularly looking at meditation-based practices. All of those are really great. Doing breath work, so focusing on your breath, can be another very accessible way to practice mindfulness, and that can just be found by focusing on inhales and exhales, focusing on the feeling of your chest raising as you make that inhale and your chest dropping as you make the exhale. So really simple. We breathe every minute of the day. It's something that you can take with you. And then as we practice together, doing a body scan. And if you feel like you need to ground yourself, especially in a heightened state of panic or anxiety, I really recommend doing something like a body scan that helps you get back in touch with your body. I know with some of my clients who have, past experiences of trauma or adverse experiences in general, they often disassociate, which is essentially, leaving your body in some capacity, whether it's, seeing yourself from a distance or just feeling disconnected in some capacity. A body scan can help mitigate and speak to that in a meaningful way. So what are the what skills? So you want to observe, which means notice what's going on around you and pay attention. Again, try to do that without that judgment as well. You want to describe by labeling what you observe. Find a way to put it into words to your experience, feelings, thoughts, and actions. Again, when I introduce you to that feeling wheel, that's what we're doing there. We want to really identify and label exactly what we are experiencing. We want to label that as accurately as possible. Then you want to participate by throwing yourself completely into those activities of the present moment. Try to go with the flow. A caveat to that is that we always are promoting people to be more mindful, to be more present. With that said, we can't always be present, we can't always be mindful, and that's okay. That's not what I'm trying to encourage. I think as a general rule of thumb, most of us can benefit from greater mindfulness and being more present, but there's no way we can, because it's naturally, as humans, we're also living in the past and the future as well. We want to live in the present a little bit more often, but it's okay that we naturally slip into the past and the future. That's just something that we want to be mindful of as well. And then that kind of non-judgmentally that I keep referring to as well. So you want to see, but don't evaluate as good or bad. Acknowledge the difference between helpful and harmful, safe and dangerous, but don't necessarily judge them. Especially the way that you're feeling things as well. The more that we judge things can exacerbate challenging feelings. It can create further feelings of frustration as well. So being mindful of that you're giving yourself that kind of meaningful space, and that you're not being too hard on yourself or those around you. Again, being aware, being present allows you to be aware of that kind of judgment that we would otherwise impose upon ourselves and others. It gives us the opportunity to suspend that. And then one mindfully is doing one thing at a time. So be in the moment and let go of distractions. And I think this is one of the hardest things about mindfulness practice is the singularity of our attention. We get conditioned over time to have that kind of monkey mind where we're jumping around from thought to thought to thought. I know for myself, when I started doing mindfulness-based practices, that was the hardest thing for my mind to train on, was focusing on one thing at a time. So again, if you notice the first dozen times that you try meditation or mindfulness-based practice, your mind will probably still be jumping around. It's not because you're doing it wrong. It just takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can focus on one thing at once. So don't be discouraged by that. That's exactly what you want to be mindful of, though. And again, the more that you do these mindfulness-based practices, the more you're going to notice that throughout the day as well. And that's inherently going to help improve your focus, help provide some relaxation, and just a break in general, which is really nice. And so that's something to also be very cognizant of. So now let's practice. Let's make this more of a practical workshop. So this is one of the best mindfulness grounding tools that I offer to all my clients, especially ones that are experiencing anxiety and panic attacks. So if you're someone who has heightened anxiety or has panic attacks, you start feeling your heart rate increasing, you start disassociating, maybe you're panicking to the point of passing out. This is a very, very helpful experience that allows you to be present with your sensory experience, as we talked about with the eating and the walking. This is an exercise you can take with you anywhere at any time. So it's called the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. What you want to do is start with 5 things that you can see. And this could be anything. It could be a spot on the ceiling, the pen in front of you, your toes, your fingers, the notebook, the laptop. So anything around you in your environment, label 5 things that you can see. Then you want to do 4 things that you can hear. So that might be the ground under your feet, the pencil that you're holding, the cushion underneath your bottom, the laptop you're typing on. So anything that you can feel, your hair maybe. 3 things that you can hear. So that might be the birds chirping outside, sirens, yeah, your obnoxious neighbors down below, your parents, whatever is in your environment. Notice 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell. Maybe it's your laundry or the pillow or your pencil. And then 1 thing that you can taste, and that might just be the coffee that you're drinking, the gum you're chewing, your sandwich from lunch, or the saliva that you have in your mouth currently. So 5-4-3-2-1. It's just drawing on all 5 senses. It's pretty easy to remember, pretty accessible. So if you're feeling anxious, really great grounding tool you can use to promote that present mind and mindfulness in general. The next exercise is called box breathing. It's something that I recommend to all my clients as well. Breathing exercises are very, very helpful, not only as a tool for mindfulness, but also as a way to kind of respond to our stress response. So we talked earlier in the workshop about how threat is often the most pervasive emotion that we're experiencing, and we want to be mindful of that. And so one of the ways that we can challenge that feeling of threat is through a bottom-up approach of focusing on our physiological response to danger, to threat, to harm, to stress. And so breathing is one of the easiest, most accessible and effective ways to respond to that stress response. What's important about breathing exercises, I always mention this, is that when you inhale, that actually increases your heart rate, which is why when we hyperventilate, we're having those really short inhales, and that's going to continue putting us into a state of panic. So although an inhale is required for an exhale, the exhale is most important. So a long, slow exhale is what's going to reduce your heart rate. It's going to tell the emotional control center of your brain that we're not in fight or flight, we're not in danger, things are okay. It's going to stop releasing hormones like cortisol or adrenaline. It's going to put you in a better state of mind to think about things more rationally, more objectively, and with less judgment. So anytime that we look at a breathing exercise, we want to focus on a long, slow exhale. And that's why when you see this breathing exercise, you can see that the exhale is for the longest amount of time. So let's do this together. So we're going to inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, exhale slowly through your mouth for 6 seconds, and then hold for another 2. So let's do this together. So inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale for 6, hold for 2, and then repeat that a few times. Repeat that 3 to 6 times. You'll notice that you feel a little bit more relaxed, especially if you're focusing on that long, slow exhale. If your heart rate's up a little bit, you will notice an instant decrease in that heart rate, and just a clearer way to think about things as well. So really helpful, practical, easy, accessible tool. So people always say deep breathing exercises are helpful. Here's an exercise. And just to be clear, I will send all of these tools after the session, so you can have those at your disposal. Exercise 3 is observing our thoughts. And so, as demonstrated, we really want to be mindful of that relationship between emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So, to start that exercise, I want you to think about, how was that exercise for you? How was the breathing exercise for you? What are you feeling now? What are you thinking about now? If you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, I encourage you to do so. Someone said calming and relaxing. That is great to hear. That's exactly what we want to achieve. And again, when we looked at the benefits of mindfulness, the goals of mindfulness, we saw practice and relaxation as those two first levels. So you've all achieved that already. You're already there. So it's not that hard. That's why I said it's easy in nature a lot of the time. Someone else said they feel calm. Thank you for sharing that. That's great to hear. I'm really happy to hear that this is already working for some of you and promoting a feeling of relaxation. So that's something that you can take with you. And that's what we want to start with mindfulness. You don't have to jump into an hour-long meditation. It can be as simple as mindful eating, walking, or breathing. So think about that as you go forward. I'm glad that that's helpful, and hopefully that can be encouraging for you. So thinking about these practical mindfulness tools, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to practicing more mindfulness? Maybe historically there's been barriers you faced. Maybe when you think about practicing what we've been talking about now, you think about barriers. I really would love to hear what you find challenging about mindfulness-based practices, and if I can offer some insight towards that. Time management skills. Yeah. So as students, I know time management is incredibly difficult. There's always more you could and feel like should be doing. And it's hard to even do 5 minutes of meditation because it takes away from that. What I want to say about that is that when we are worried about time management, especially, studying, preparing for assignments or whatever, anytime we take away from that can create additional anxiety. We want to approach that with a logical understanding that if we are concerned about not having enough time and that we're not going to be able to be focused, well, what's more helpful and beneficial for that? What's going to help meet those needs? Is it studying for 8 hours where you're not that focused, where you're feeling exhausted, where you're feeling stressed out, where you're feeling anxious? Or is it better to take 2 hours, do some mindfulness based practices, take a rest, go on a walk, maybe meditate for a little bit, and then spend 6 hours where you're actually focused, feeling more relaxed, feeling less anxious, and able to engage in a more meaningful way. So I know, and that's a hard mental hurdle to get over to, even when you can apply that logical framework, but reminding yourself that it doesn't have to take long, and that usually the things that we were most concerned about with time management can help be alleviated through greater relaxation, focus, attention, and present mindedness. And so you want to be cognizant of that the things that we're most worried about are often what we need to be doing to kind of get over that. So again, if you're worried about focusing in your studies, mindfulness is going to be helpful for that. So make the time for that, and that can help provide peace of mind and justification for taking that time away from that. So I get that. I hear that all the time from students, that there just isn't enough time. And as an aside from that, something I've talked to a lot of folks about during the pandemic is there's been this challenge with productivity. I'm not feeling productive enough. I'm not able to be productive. And something that I've encouraged a lot of folks to do is to broaden that definition of productivity to not just include tangible products or outcomes like studying or creating assignments or working, but in broadening the definition of productivity, include what your needs are. And more often than not, one of our needs is going to be greater relaxation, time to ourselves, time for focus, time for a break. And those things are going to be conducive to those conventional ideas around productivity as well. So that can be another great way to kind of help justify that. Because again, I know I was a student a few years ago. I understand the challenge of taking time away from your studies. It can be really stress inducing. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. So tips to keep in mind, pun intended. So there's a few things that I want you to take away from this. So set a reasonable goal, like once a week. So you don't have to start every day. You can start slow, planning for 1 or 2 minutes of mindfulness. Doesn't have to be meditation. There's other ways to do it as we've identified. Schedule in and make time for it, even if you don't do it. It's important to just try to make it a habit, try to build that within your routine. Start with a technique that you like the best. So if you've tried meditation and it doesn't work for you, try something else for a little bit. Try one of the activities that we talked about, whether that's mindful eating or walking or breathing or the 5 4 3 2 1 exercise. Try one of these more accessible activities and then work up to meditation or one of the more structured, rigid techniques. There is no right or wrong way of doing it as long as you're noticing and observing what you are doing. So that's the essence of it. So don't get too caught up in how you're doing it. Just make sure that you are noticing and observing what you are doing. Put a meditation pillow chair in the bathroom even, give yourself that space. Practice while you brush your teeth, practice while you get ready for work, ready for school. Write a sticky note to remind yourself to practice for 1 minute before you open your laptop. So it's really easy to kind of just get started with our day. If you can just practice mindfulness for 1 minute, you're already going to be at an advantage. So there's lots of great ways to start practicing mindfulness. It doesn't have to be too difficult. Follow these general guidelines and that will be helpful. And to come full circle, just to kind of reiterate some of these major points. So mindfulness is paying attention on purpose to the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding experience of moment by moment. It's simple, but it's not easy. And you can start anywhere, anytime, so as long as you're noticing and observing you're doing it. Someone said, what's your favorite technique to use? Great question. For me personally, I like to use a mix of different techniques. So when I'm going through a lot of stress, I really like to use meditation, though I find it to be less accessible because, like as someone mentioned, I find it hard to even put away 5 minutes, even though I know I should. So I like to use these more informal techniques, such as breathing. The mindful eating is something I try to do every day. Even if I have 15 minutes to eat my lunch, that's an opportunity for me to just be mindful, to put down my phone. So I try to tend to opt for the ones that are most accessible. Most people have really busy lives. And so taking 5 minutes doesn't even seem that practical sometimes. So trying to integrate it in ways that's accessible is the best. And that's how I find that's worked for me, is how can I make this most accessible for me? So I tend to use more of those informal techniques towards mindfulness. Okay. So any other questions? That's a great question. Love that. Any other questions, thoughts on mindfulness? Again, any challenges that you've maybe faced, any curiosities towards it, or just any general comments or feedback are always welcome. Again, I want to thank everybody for engaging throughout the session. That's been really helpful. I hope everybody was able to take something away from this. I will make sure that the recording and all the tools that we've been looking at today are sent to you. And if you have any other questions or thoughts, or you want to reach out, if you're interested in therapy, you can reach out to me. My email is mitch@shiftcollab.com. Here is my email, pop in the chat as well. So if something comes to you after this session and you think about it, feel free to just send me an email. Happy to respond at any time. Again, really happy that you're all able to engage today. And I'll leave this open for another few minutes. I'm not going to sign off quite yet, just to see if there's any other questions. I'll stop the recording for now as well.